specific but still very important topic, the correlation between protection of civilians and the hybrid threats. We have quite a number of speakers and participants of the panel discussion who will share their thoughts. There's the main speaker who will present the preliminary findings of our research, of our study. But at the beginning of our discussion, let's set the number of questions, a number of issues, so that you know what we're talking about and make it effective and productive. So the first question is, which hybrid threats, which manifestations of hybrid threats influence the civilians, and how is it manifested? How can we respond to these threats and minimize the damage for the civilians? What are their solutions? And especially in Ukrainian context, what are the roles of different stakeholders in this process, starting with the state agencies and structures and authorities, the government, the military men, and the entire circle of those who participate in responding to these hybrid threats. We have a fantastic team of experts talking, and the experts, but I want to present to you, first of all, our advisor, Ewan Lawson. Also, to give you a little bit of a context, when we first got this idea to study the correlation between hybrid threats and protection of civilians, my colleague Beatrice Godefroy suggested to contact this person, the best, most outstanding expert in this sphere. He is an associate fellow at Royal United Services Institute, the British facility, and he also works with the International Red Cross Committee. He also used to be an officer for many years, an officer of the British Royal Army. So for him, all of these issues are that's the sphere of his expertise that he can share. He will now present the results of the preliminary results of the study that we started this summer. We ran a number of interviews, studied the documents, and this is what we got as a result. After Ewan presents his thoughts, I will also give the floor to several experts on this topic so that they present their perspective, share their thoughts, and also you'll have the chance to ask your questions, address your questions to the experts, not only to those who are here in the room, but also to those who are online, who speak to us via Zoom.
The floor is yours. Can you hear us? Зараз сподіваємося, що ми виправимо.
Hopefully we'll have Ewan online hearing and speaking. Ewan is out there in Vietnam, quite far from us, so I think the little time lag is natural in this case.
Ewan, can you hear us? No, just say. We'll try to figure it out. Ну, перед тим, я думаю, як зараз наші...
So before our tech guys find a way to bring Ewan to us, I think I should add a couple of issues. Let me just add a couple of ideas more. So in our time, we When we started the study, we tried to define the factors that add to the hybrid war narrative. But in order to find out about those factors, I personally tried to study the narratives and the ideas that come from the occupied territories, from Russian Federation, and the damage to civilians. This issue was very vividly present out there in the narrative. So it was my just a second. We are still waiting to have Ewan with us.
We can hear you now. Can you? You in? No?
On the plus side, you and I can now hear you.
Thanks, Ben. We'll try.
Can't hear anything from the conference.
Uh-huh. Okay.
The Zoom mic for the conference is muted.
Угу. Якщо можна, там в технічному подивіться, чому мікрофон той, що від нас, який йде, нас не чує.
Let's check the sound of the microphone.
Окей. Ну, ще будемо працювати над цим. Так от, і
So when this idea first appeared, it was difficult to find understanding from other experts. Everyone thought that these topics do not have a lot in common. But back in 2018, this topic proved necessary, and hopefully, if we have Ewan here, he'll tell us the results of his research, of his study, with his immense experience in this sphere. I think he'll be able to tell us a lot. Still trying to find a way to talk to Ewan. We want to present the results of our research, and it's logical to have Ewan first, but if like in 5 minutes we don't find a way to technically bring him to us, then I suggest we skip over to other online speakers who do hear us and who would be able to speak to us and present their thoughts, because we just can't afford sitting here around. Ви нас чуєте, да?
then.
Okay, forgive me. Obviously, I've missed all of the introductions, but expecting we can talk about, so I'll press on. Really, what I want to talk about is our understanding of hybrid and how we talk about hybrid, and then something about how our research that we've been conducting over the last couple of months around Ukraine has identified some particular issues. But I think the first thing is to recognise that hybrid is a bit of a vogue label, particularly since 2014 and the occupation of Crimea and operations in the Donbass. And I think in part it reflects this idea that there was something new going on. And as a result, you saw, particularly in sort of Western academic and policymaking conversations, a whole set of labels being applied to what people were seeing, ambiguous, grey zone, threshold, and only in the last few months, David Kilcullen has come up with the idea of liminal warfare. Ultimately, though, what we're really looking at is aggressors whose aim is to achieve strategic outcomes while staying below the threshold of a response. Often a military response, and in the case of Ukraine, a Western military response. Now, these approaches utilise all of the levers of national diplomatic, the informational, the military, and the economic, but often linked to a degree of obfuscation and campaigns of disinformation. One of the things I think it's important to recognize, though, is that hybrid threats, or hybrid activity, perhaps more accurately, are delivered both at the immediate location of a conflict, so as part of traditional military activity, kinetic military activity, but also further away. I mean, in military parlance, there's a close hybrid battle and a deep hybrid battle. And indeed, it's been suggested by one particular study that what we should do is refer to the stuff that's happening in this particular context around the Donbass as hybrid warfare, because there is fighting involved, and use the term hybrid threat to apply to those things that take place at a greater distance. So, for example, the interference in a referendum in the Netherlands on Ukraine's relationship with the European Union. There are, of course, a number of critiques of the idea, the concept of hybrid, and I'll mention two of those just now. The first one is that it's not new that states use all of the levers of their national power to achieve objectives. And certainly you can look at activity from all of history to see where aggressive powers have used all of the levers of national power. Indeed, Jens Stoltenberg said at one point that really hybrid is the sort of dark side of what has been labeled in the West a comprehensive approach, this idea of using all of the levers of national power. However, I do think that the label, notwithstanding that criticism, does act as a very useful reminder that this idea that there's a period of peace and then a period of war, and that there's a separate divide between the two things, is not a useful construct for policymakers to be thinking about in this day and age. The second critique is that the term is really just too broad to be meaningful. If everything is hybrid, what are the boundaries between statecraft and war fighting? If everything is labelled as sort of hybrid warfare, is there a risk of just responding with the military, a very militarized response, and hence potentially leading to escalation? And I think we need to, that takes us back into any response to hybrid does need to be whole of government and not just the military. Unsurprisingly, perhaps, with some of this conceptual vagueness, there are multiple definitions out there, even within organizations. I mean, I found 2 or 3 existing within NATO, for example. But ultimately, what we're really talking about, we want to kind of focus down, it's about the synchronized use of multiple instruments of power tailored to specific vulnerabilities across the full spectrum of societal functions to achieve synergistic effects. And what makes it, I think, different in the 21st century, makes it different now, is the way that it's being enabled by technology. So having kind of talked broadly about the idea of hybrid, and I think I do think it's important that we have some sort of common shared sense of what we mean by hybrid. What we've been doing with our work in Ukraine is to look at where the hybrid threats, the hybrid activities, if you like, are taking place, not geographically, but in terms of the sort of strands of activity. And we've identified 5 main strands, and I don't think any of these will come as a surprise to anyone in the room. Ideas of information and narrative warfare, ideas of economic coercion, the use of cyber attacks, the use of political warfare, and the use of lawfare. And when we think about this in terms of the risk of civilian harm, I think we can see that potentially the main form of civilian harm is psychological. And for our work, we are using a fairly broad definition of civilian harm, one that includes not just physical damage, but psychological damage, and also access to basic services. But even when we talk about psychological harm, I think we have to recognize that that may well have physical effects, such as increases in suicide and domestic violence. But when we look at the information campaigns, what are we seeing? Well, directly linked to, if you like, the hybrid warfare end, to the campaigns in the east and the south of Ukraine, we are seeing activity which is about creating false narratives around civilian casualties and how those have been caused. But I think more broadly, what we're seeing, and we see this in hybrid activity more broadly, is efforts to exploit divisions within society. Those divisions may initially be quite small, almost natural divisions within society, but they're then being exploited. So in the case of Ukraine, we've seen not only the very obvious exploitation around quote unquote ethnicity and the issues of Russian language, but also efforts to create divisions with the Hungarian population. We've seen campaigns around the language of family values, the idea that these are something inherent in perhaps in Orthodox society, and that these are counter to Western liberal values. So, for example, particularly attacks on things like the LGBT community. And whilst clearly there's obviously a risk of psychological harm from these campaigns, there's also obviously the risk of violence between groups, of which the continuing fighting in the Donbass is the most obvious example. These campaigns are delivered by both the mainstream and by social media, and indeed we see crossovers between the two. And in some previous work I did looking at Islamic State, we saw how messages put out by Islamic State on social media were eventually picked up by the mass media and repeated without being checked. And some of this is about issues to do with the resourcing of contemporary journalism, but there are also issues around the ownership of the mainstream media and the degree of transparency around the ownership of mainstream media. Economic coercion, there's an awful lot that can be said about the economic ties which exist between the Ukraine and Russia. Perhaps the most obvious one has been the control of gas supplies and the potential for civilian harm from manipulation of those gas supplies, whether by cost or simply by turning supply on and off is obvious. But interestingly, I think whilst we tend to try to categorize these things, there's an awful lot of overlap between the activities. So we saw links to cyber attacks on the power grid. This idea of a loss of essential services, again, more risk of psychological harm because of the uncertainty around those essential services. We see the funding of extreme political parties, both on the left and on the right, and the capture of civil society organizations, so-called astroturfing. And the intent of this, again, is just to increase that social division. So what can be done about this? Well, the first thing I would emphasize is there is no quick win here. There is no silver bullet. There's no simple solution until such time as the aggressor stops being aggressive. And there doesn't seem to be much sign of that anytime soon. So I think the first thing I would point out is that we need to develop a more detailed, a more nuanced understanding both of the threat activities and of their impact. I mean, I've talked fairly openly about ideas of psychological harm, but I'm not sure we have a real sense of the extent of that psychological harm. I think there's a need for more research, frankly. And obviously, and I say this as a former military psychological operations officer, there is always a challenge in directly linking information activity in particular to the effect that it achieves. But I do think with some more research, we can start building a better picture. And part of developing that better picture isn't just to make policymakers informed, but it's also to help inform the population, which is an essential step in providing with protection. There's a need, therefore, to ensure a free media and civil society. This is a challenge in any society, but one that's under pressure, clearly more so. And that's about making sure not only that where lies are told, those are dealt with, where funding is not transparent, that's addressed as well, but also making sure that there is a freedom of speech as well. There's a risk always in trying to ensure that an aggressor, a hybrid aggressor, can't over-influence through media, for example, that you run the risk of actually almost achieving their own aim by closing down those sources. There's a need to improve cybersecurity. That's pretty much a global need, but it does require some focus. There's a need to continue to constrain the use of military force in the context of the Donbass that risks civilian harm. And also, though, not just to do that, but to keep the population, both in the region and more broadly, informed as to the steps being taken. Be prepared to challenge false narratives, particularly around civilian casualties, with evidence where appropriate, and maintaining a strong civil-military dialogue. So I think these are the things that we need to be thinking about now as policy objectives. But in the longer term, I think there's a need to consider the benefits of a total defense strategy. Now, we may talk about this more in the rest of the session, but total defense strategies, particularly as seen in the Nordic states, the Baltic states, but also in places like Singapore, Georgia has adopted a total defense approach, are about really integrating civil defense with military defense. And whilst there are lessons clearly to be learned from those states who already practice this approach, it would have to be tailored to the specific context of Ukraine. I think also we need to develop a focus, or to keep developing the focus on resilience, but not just from this infrastructure perspective, which is where particularly NATO is very enthused and has some very interesting ideas, I think, to share, but also this business of societal resilience. And that almost takes you back to the beginning, having a better understanding of where the potential fractures in society are and how to keep people informed as to the threats and risk. And a big part of that is in engaging with others and taking lessons from wherever you can. That's all for now. I'm very happy to discuss these further as we move on. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Ewan, for this presentation. That you've covered this issue and also the possible ways of solving it. I would like to add that our research can become a pioneer research, which will become a ground for the Center of Excellence on protection of civilians and counteracting the warfare by legal tools. That's why I'm inviting all the participants to facilitate through sharing your ideas, your opinions on this topic, on the topic of protection of civilians and hybrid war. So please keep your questions to Euron and to all other speakers. You will have the chance to ask after all the speakers present their speeches. So please note them, and then you will have the chance to put your questions. I think it will be a very fruitful ground for discussion. And now to come back to our Ukrainian context, I would like to pass the floor to Lyubov Cibulska, the head of the hybrid threat analysis group of the Ukrainian Crisis Media Center. and Ms. Lubov has collaborated with the armed forces in the area of strategic communication. And also she collaborated with the Vice Minister office, and I think that's one of the areas where we could find some solutions to this very pressing issue. That's why I'm passing the floor to Mrs. Lubov Cybulska. Do we have the chance to have her on the screen? We can't hear you. I represent the Ukrainian medicine, and we have collaborated with the General Staff of Ukraine, and in 2017 we established our group, and we are analyzing hybrid threats and with the aim at disinformation. Today we're speaking about the protection of civilians, and civilians could not exist behind the armed forces. So just recollect the first years of the Ukrainian-Russian war, the active phase, how the Russian Federation was trying to disintegrate the armed forces and the population. It was a very massive information campaign. The armed forces were on the other side from the population, and they were trying to promote this narrative that it's a war inside the country, because none of the soldiers will not have the will to perform the tasks if he or she knows that there is no support on the part of the population. And I would like also to recollect about this specific features of this influence campaign. Sometimes they are called psychological campaigns. According to the strategic documents of a lot of foreign countries, they are supporting campaigns to the active operations. According to the Russian documents of their general staff, those campaigns exist without any linkage to the armed operations. So, and knowing this, we can understand how the Russian Federation thinks and how they are promoting their agenda and their national interests. We also remember that civilians in the near front area could be both the target and the tool of the hybrid war. And we should recollect the first months of the active phase of the war in 2014. And they had a very thorough campaign with the locals and also of the soldiers brought from the Russia. They Russian Federation managed to establish a sort of a defense line from the population. I think it took several weeks. So I remember this time when our armed forces moved forward and they overcome this barrier. Our group had been analyzing all those hybrid tools of the Russian Federation, and we've noticed that there is a number of them. So usually they mix them. First of all, that's work with the local elite, with the politicians, with the opinion leaders, and according to the opinion polls, people are inclined to trust to those whom they believe, whom they trust. It's a very effective tool. Then these are some provocative actions on the part of the special services. The history of the new Sancharas. There are a lot of suspicions that it was organized by the Russian special services, and of course it destabilizes the region a lot. Then the church, the Russian Orthodox Church, we also were checking the narrative of the Russian Orthodox Church, and we've noticed how different they are in eastern and western parts of Ukraine. In the eastern part of Ukraine, they were saying that it's a spiritual war and that they should kill the opponents. And in the western part, they were saying that the war between brothers and that the EU who made the brothers quarrel. Also, the disinformation campaigns, and one of the most important tools is media. In Ukraine, there are several pro-Russian TV channels, and we know to whom they belong to. And we see that Mr. Medvedchuk is starting new regional channels. Odessa Live, they are planning to have Kharkiv and Dnipro Live channel. So the regional TV channels are about the trust, about the regional context and increasing the trust. They are preparing to the elections, but their main aim is to bring their people to all levels of powers. And this complex of tools of influence operations leads to the demoralization of the society. And this is one of the biggest threats, because we are tired of the war, of the crisis, of the poverty, and of economical crisis. And thus, when the society is demoralized, the level of resilience is lower. What can be done and what should be done? I would be talking about two levels. The strategic one, and it should be a well-articulated strategy of the occupation of the territories. About the information policy, there should be a strategy of the information policy in the eastern part and for the whole Ukraine. This strategy should be clear not only to the representatives of political powers, but also to the population. It's very important to the eastern and southern regions of Ukraine. So they should know where we are moving to. And the second part is practical one. Sorry. So we cannot move forward without the strategic documents. And here we are coming to the point of the communication of the armed forces, about the channels of communication, how the General Staff and the Ministry of Defense explain to the population their actions. I had the honor to be the part of the communications of the General Staff in 2015, for example, in Twitter and in Facebook. Now we can see that the number of the threats increased. There are messengers which became the biggest source of disinformation. We have to take it into account and to include in your activities. Very important to understand the informational threats are not the distorted facts on the TV. The provocations and the protests, as in news and channels, or fake letters, this is a more detailed and tiny tools, but they are effective. And also what we should say to the civil services in the regions and in the population. The population, we should understand the regional vulnerable areas and how they could be used by the enemy, from the free economic zone in Odessa or the environment threats in the Zaporizhia region. So we should forecast the possible scenarios. It's our common goal, and we can do it without waiting for some roadmaps on the part of the power. And then cyber defense and the critical infrastructure protection. And it's a threat not only for now, but which will increase in the coming years. So we should increase the capabilities. A nice story which could illustrate the Russian actions in this area, maybe you remember, it was 1 year ago. The TV channel Gorodok was attacked, it was hacked. And they had this multimedia stairs, and suddenly they had this fascist sign on their stairs, and it was posted in Twitter, and different NGOs, both Ukrainian, international, and Russian, were attacked, and it was written, and they were saying, of course, there are no fascism in Ukraine. And we checked how this tweet just overloaded. So when the trading center Gorodok mentioned that they were hacked, and we were sending these messages to the pages who reposted it, and saw that in fact almost no one retweeted this even the expert, the journals, they ignored this information. So this debunking covered a less population that the fake news.
Thank you very much, Ms. Luba, for this deep analysis of Ukrainian happenings in the sphere of hybrid threats and their influence on the civil population in various aspects. And once again, I remind you that you can note your questions, write them down, and address them to our speakers later. Now back to the international arena, so to speak. I'm talking about the senior expert of NATO Strategic Communications Center of Excellence. I'm giving the floor to Ben Heap, who has been working in communication for over 22 years, experienced in mainstream media work, and also he spent over 5 years in Afghanistan, working in the military sphere together with the British Royal Army and as a representative of NATO in the information sphere. And with the Riga Center and NATO, he's been with them since 2016, and his expertise and perspective is important, especially important, because in 2015-16 the Center for Strategic Communications of Excellence, Center of Excellence. They have been presenting the report on the most popular narratives about the Ukrainian army that were exploited by the opponents, by Ukrainian opponents of Ukraine. I think that the Center of Excellence the Riga Center can also become the future partner for civic in Ukraine and enforcing its scientific component. So I'm giving the floor to Ben Heap. Hopefully he can hear us with no technical problems.
Yeah, I can hear you. Just give me some kind of sign that you can hear me.
Yeah, fine.
Okay, thank you very much. So this morning I'm going to talk about the importance of integrated communication in the context of hybrid threats. As Ewan said a few minutes ago, the term hybrid threats is contested. The definitions have changed in parallel with the conflicts that they have been used to describe. But we can talk about hybrid threats, we can talk about hostile influence, we can talk about asymmetric warfare or below threshold warfare. The phenomena, the concepts are the same. So what we're talking about is a range of activities across the instruments of power that are ultimately all about influencing political decision-making capability. So there's nothing particularly new about that. What has changed is that technology, particularly from a communications perspective, the speed, cost, and access has made everything a lot more connected, and things move a lot quicker. So that decision-making much easier for people to influence. So that the business of integrated communication and the way that we would see it, this is all about understanding audiences and having a coherent cross-government approach to influence those audiences, bearing in mind that your adversary is also trying to influence those audiences, and they are using a wide range of means in order to do that. So that could be economic coercion, it could be political subversion, it could be the use or threat of force, so the use of the military or force in order to influence. So we're trying to understand how our adversary is influencing our audiences, and we want to counter that influence. So some might call this the hearts and minds approach. Well, we can probably apply a bit more science and a bit more organization to that concept these days. This isn't about adhering to international law or humanitarian standards, although those are vitally important. This is about the application of military doctrine in order to achieve military strategic objectives. So having established that threats are of all kinds are ultimately about influencing political decision-making, and adversaries use a wide means of do that, a wide range of means to do that. These threats, these activities exploit vulnerabilities in a targeted country in order to influence those politics through different audiences. And in the context of today's discussion, the focus is on civilians. So we're interested in the way that the adversary influences civilians through those various means. And people make decisions. The way that people see the world is not just about what they read on their Facebook page or see on television, although that is important. People's attitudes and the way that they see the world is heavily influenced by their real experience. So their interactions with local government or the military, their experience of local services, the time it takes to move around, to transit through border points, etc., etc. And propaganda is just one part of that. Propaganda is just one part of the way that they see the world. The provision of healthcare, financial support, freedom of movement probably has more of an influence in how they see the government and the relationship with the state. So the start point is for us to understand that audience and why they see the world the way that they do. And we can use a variety of methods to do that, such as polling, interviews, etc., mixed methods, to understand their identity, how they feel about security, insecurity or security, stability, safety, and their relationship with the government, both local and national, bearing in mind that their relationship with the government may be through the military. It may be in the contested zones, that this is the conflict zones. This is the only contact that they have with the direct contact that they have with the government. So understanding the dynamics of that and how they relate to the state and how they relate to the government, you may find some of those answers are uncomfortable, but as someone said yesterday, this is a question of accountability. We need to be able to understand that relationship, because if it's a vulnerability, we need to be able to resolve it. We need to understand where those weaknesses are so we can address them effectively. So responding to those vulnerabilities is where the integrated communication approach comes in. Actions must match words. If you are saying that people are, as citizens, are more valued to one nation than they are to another, or you have a obligation to protect, as Ewan's talked about, then that has to be matched through actions as well as words, and they need to be coordinated. And that needs to be a cross-government activity from the education, the health, and the military. Because it may be that one aspect is responsible for the processing or the administration of compensation claims, and the other is responsible for paying out, and it needs to be a cross-government effort. And this also highlights the importance of having CIMIC teams on the ground, as this may be one of the few touch points that you have in order to act as a conduit between the local population and the government. And what this does when we identify these vulnerabilities and we address these vulnerabilities, this builds resilience. So it means that we are communicating with the population in a way which is more effective than our adversary is. And remember, when I say communicating, that means it's about that relationship. It's about that interaction. It is not just about what they read on Facebook or the television. It is about their relationship with the government. And if that is a strong one and that is a favorable one, then you are going to influence your target audience more effectively than your adversary is. So to summarize, hybrid threats or hostile influence, whatever you want to call it, is all about the use of different means in order to influence political decision-making capability. And what we're interested in is beating that. So we're interested in understanding how that might happen, exploit our vulnerabilities, understanding the audiences and how they feel about those vulnerabilities, and addressing those vulnerabilities as a cross-government response. And that story, if you like, that story that we tell, that narrative, when we address those concerns and we build that relationship between the public and the state, that's integrated communication. That's how you build resilience. And that's how ultimately you will win politically. So pending any questions, that's me complete.
Дуже дякую, Бен, за такий надзвичайно глибокий.
Thank you, Ben, for this in-depth analysis. And we can see that once again, we're hearing these definitions: resilience. And the response to these challenges, building a protection system against hybrid threats to the civilians. Here it's important to unify the international experience from the NATO Strategic Communication Center of Influence of Excellence, and with what we have in Ukraine. The initiatives like StopFake.org project and its head, and I'm giving the floor to him, Yevgen Fedchenko, head of Mogyla School of Journalism at National University of Kiev Mogyla Academy. I think no one knows as much as he about the narratives exploited by the opponents, the stories they're telling, because it's the stories that make up the the fabric of the relations between people. Storytelling is what runs the society as such. We're not just telling the stories, we are the stories ourselves. So if we change them, we change the narrative, we change the narrative of the society. So, Mr. Yevgen, I'd like to give you the floor if you can hear us. Can you hear us, Mr. Yevgen? We're having a little bit of a technical lag here. Let's try to contact Yevgen once again. Good morning, Sergey. Thank you very much for presenting me and for the appraisal of our project. The previous speakers already highlighted a lot of info on hybrid threats, but I'd like to discuss one specific aspect, the information component as part of the hybrid threats. It's true that StopFake has been working since 2004, analyzing the narratives, the emerging narratives, and since 2014, in these 6 years, we've been classifying and analyzing and studying these threats, how serious they are, how urgent they are to tackle, what platforms they use, which narratives. And this is exactly what StopFake has been doing for the last 6 years, and the information we gathered is demonstrating several important issues. First, the threats of disinformation is ongoing. It is still here. Those threats never went anywhere, actually. The only thing that's changing is some of the narrative lines, and they might use some new platforms. They used to broadcast it via Russian media and Russian social media, social networks. Nowadays, they are shifting to Ukrainian-based platforms located here in Ukraine, which makes them less vulnerable to regulation. Or they're using global social networks like Facebook and partly Twitter. And this proves that those who create and distribute disinformation have an all-encompassing approach to their works. So, alongside with using Russian media, they keep searching for new opportunities, and quite quickly they adapt to them. This is point number one. We are having to deal with a very adaptive approach. They find new platforms really quickly and get used and get people hooked on these media really quickly. Concerning the narratives, on one hand, some of them stay the same. For instance, a narrative as Ukraine as a fascist state, or the narrative about Ukraine as a militarized state. But they are also developing new narratives. For instance, before Ukrainian elections, they've been trying to force this narrative about the so-called external management, supervision of Ukraine, of Ukrainian authorities, foreign influence in Ukraine. They're trying to prove that Ukraine is not a sovereign state. It's been managed from London or from Washington or from NATO or by NATO. Depends on which fake we're talking about. they are using this narrative when telling about the joint forces trainings, or buying, or when they're saying that Ukraine is buying nuclear fuel from Westinghouse, and so on. They've developed new narratives related to COVID. And there's an entire, this is really exciting segment, information-wise. There's a new tendency. That's very disturbing. On one hand, we can see that Ukrainian audience becomes more educated and informed about fake news. According to one of the polls, about 72% of Ukrainians are aware that there is disinformation in their around them, in the environment. But it's not enough just to know, just to be aware. The question is, what do they do? So this awareness creates a higher threshold of perceiving these news. So the type of reaction, the type of responding to these fake news has become more complicated. So people know about the COVID threat. They realize this. The question is, how is this transformed into real life, actual activity, their everyday behavior? Do they take account of the information received? And if so, how? The same relates to the fake news about the military activity of the army. So Ukrainians have gotten used to the fact that there is war somewhere, but it doesn't influence me. It's not my war. It's not my issue. I don't have to be anxious about it. Ukrainians became very fake news numb. So on the other hand, the Internews report shows us another disturbing tendency: the rise of the increase of consumption of Russian media. It's only several percent, but the problem is the tendency. The tendency used to be decreasing every year, but there's been a U-turn, and the consumption of Russian media is growing. This is a scary tendency for me, because in Russian media sources, disinformation is still thriving. It's multiplying. It's adaptive. It takes into account the specific features of every country. It's tailor-made for every audience, including Ukrainian. So they are taken into account in every internal problem, economic, social problem, any social displeasements and negative tendencies, and they play on this. They try to peruse it. So what can be done here? We have experience of resilience building, but on the other hand, we can see people are tired. They are tired from counteracting, and this barrier, their protective barrier, psychological barrier, is weakening. So they are under more threat again. So Stop Fake continues to counter fake news, to disclose the lies. Our society, our audience is very fragmented, I mean Ukrainian, and each part of it is in their own little bubble. In one bubble, people are aware of the problem. In the others, they might not. They might have a different understanding of certain phenomena. They have very different narratives. They're using completely different platforms to consume this content. So we should enter those bubbles that we that who do not know us yet, the temporarily occupied territories, the Ukrainian side of the contact line. And also we should work alongside, we should cover the entire Ukrainian territory and also understand between different demographics.
When we're speaking about the youngest population, we can think that it's not vulnerable to the Russian threats linked with Russian history, but in fact they are very vulnerable because they are understanding and then sharing these Soviet narratives. That's why we have to move to TikTok and to new social medias and started to explain to them what is disinformation, what could be the fake information, and the media literacy campaigns should be started. I think that media literacy should be part of the training. So we are also developing the maps of narratives where we collect those fake news and then sharing this information with different audiences in the framework of our information literacy. Some of them are less efficient, others are more efficient, but we should understand that there is no one tool which could solve all the issues. These tools can function only in a comprehensive way, only complementing each other. We should also understand that those who are fighting disinformation, I mean the most effective projects are represented by the NGOs. That's why we have to think how we should facilitate the state-private partnerships. And also we should understand that the NGOs have limited possibilities due to the financial needs. For example, last year and the stop years was publishing the newspaper Your Right to Know for the Donetsk and Lugansk regions, 200 copies. It was a free newspaper which was telling about the disinformation, about how to find it, how to fight, about the media literacy. But unfortunately, at some point, the donors who supported this project decided that it's not important. And that's why the only source of information which had the population living in the contact line disappeared, and we do not know what they are reading, where they are taking the information. But our suspicion is that instead of the sources which we suggested, they are using the Russian sources. And it also shows what will be the outcome of this war for the hearts and minds. So if it's not sustainable, if we do not have the strategy, but are moving from one project to another one without having a comprehensive strategy, and it's an issue as well. That's why I think we'll stop at this point. And if you have any questions, I will be happy to answer. Thanks a lot for talking about the information campaign. And yes, you are completely right about saying that we should move into the information bulbs, where, like, for us, it's like extraterrestrials' lives. Of course, this information should be true. And here we have to seek for the information which is truthful. When we were speaking with Mr. Yevgen, Magda, who suggested a very nice idea that when answering to some hybrid threats, information threats, and these answers are given by different agencies. So Mr. Yevgen is one of the best experts in this area, and he is also the author of several books, Hybrid War, How to Survive, and now the book was published in English, and he also has his academic approach as he is lecturing in the university. It's very interesting to listen to your ideas. Thank you, Mr. Sergin. Thank you for the invitation. Yes, the hybrid paradox is the lecture in the Kyiv Polytechnical University to the editors, so how the media should function in the conditions of the hybrid war. And I think that that's the only course lectured in the universities all over Ukraine. It's a very interesting topic, and with the students, with the PR students, we've created a hybrid threat index. I have a small presentation as I'm a lecturer. It's a very simple one. I'm sorry if something will be very basic for you, because I intend that it's a professional audience. But I decided to provide some information for thoughts. And I'm sorry that I haven't interpreted into English, but if someone will be interested, I will translate into English and send to those interested. So, hybrid war is aiming at the conscience, but not territory. So we shouldn't assess the territory occupied, but also the level of in-depth in-depth of mind occupation. And we are fighting that Ukraine is not ready to speak about the successes. And I think that the fact that Ukraine survived over the first attack of the Russian Federation is a success itself. And the hybrid campaign is much cheaper than the military campaigns. I mixed the threats and the ways of their dispersing for purpose to attract your attention to this. So, in Ukrainian reality, it's a continuous period of when Ukraine didn't have its own state. Unfortunately, a lot of people are perceiving the Ukrainian state as not their own state. So it's a memory of generations, and we should start fighting this in the way which I will tell. So the political competition and not using the democratic procedures. So what is the threat in this? In Ukrainian society of the transition democracy, sometimes the fight for the power sometimes is proving that any tools are good. So I'm just saying about a very warning tendency. For example, at the regional level, they're starting to speak about the taxes, about the other level, and those who will be voting cannot react in the proper way for this. Then we should be speaking about the vectors of influence. even when the Russian Federation are saying that the sanctions are not effective, but they are functioning, they are real and effective because they cost for the Russian Federation's budget millions of dollars. And in the post-Soviet reality, the low level of media literacy is very low, and I think that the low literacy should be trained. The media literacy should be trained until it will be a massive course for the high school pupils and freshmen in the university. We will be in the situation of the frog, which is just trying to milk to make butter from the milk. So we are not yet the butter and not the milk, but we are still the frog. So the main ways that the aggressive influence on the collective conscience and individual, so undermining of the values of us as a whole and individuals. So Ukrainian society, to my mind, is a very conservative one and is afraid to speak about this. I will say that revolutions in 25 years doesn't mean the democratic development of the Ukrainian society. It rather means that we have made made mistakes in a systemic way, deciding who should become the messiah and the leader of the nation. And it also comes back to the historical time when we didn't have our state. Next one is the discreditation of the power, and it's a very serious aspect. When we'll see how turbulent will become the situation after the 25th of October, we will see that this pressure was organized and it exists in a very strong way. Then xenophobia and racial. We should think that in Ukraine, where we have multi-confessional and multi-ethnical population, but that's the issue which lies somewhere very deep. So Kremlin likes to work with ultra-right. It's a real threat. And fakes in the coronavirus time is the hugest issue. The fakes were dispersed 6 times faster than usual news. And now I cannot even suggest the speed. Now when people are living in the smartphones or in TVs, do not have the chance to look critically. There are 2 factors. First, that a lot of famous people are injured with COVID-19 means that people are feeling that they are insecure. And this feeling of insecure is very spread. Then the man-made catastrophes and disasters. We can see for the last 2 years how our opponents are reacting on the military operations. First in Yavoril, a Polish officer is killed, and before that the American Colonel Diary was published, and this year in the and the American military men were killed in the range, and after all those disinformation, population cannot perceive the notion that we have a good cyber security. It could not be perceived in the right way. So this year for the Russian Federation became a very special one, and Lithuania, Poland, and Latvia is the hybridization of the Holocaust. Due to the massive casualties of the Jews of the World War II, the Holocaust will be hybridized. So the vector of the activities of those they will move the idea from the fact that it was conducted by the Germans to the fact that the local population was also involved in those massive killings. The effective strategic communications, and here we have 2 points. So we have to speak with one voice. It should be a short gun approach, and you know how the quick decision-taking process is influencing the outcome. For us, it's a huge challenge that the state is not speaking in one voice. Yesterday, the Parliament adopted the pre-election decree on the prevention of COVID. It's a call line with the state. So it looks like a call line, hotline with the God. So they were established in March when the COVID coverage was the COVID pandemic only starting. So the system of common values in the society are also important. We have an issue with our self-identification, what type of state we are building. We are in the process of forming of Ukrainian political nation. And for me, it's obvious the idea of integral nationalism, which was popular 80, 90 years ago, will not be functional in Ukraine due to social and political reasons. We should form a concept of a modern, successful Ukraine. And from the point where we are. So we are this part of butter in this jar in the Europe. We are the outsiders on the level of salaries in Europe. And I'm happy that we have similar ideas with my colleague Petchenko about the partnership between private and entrepreneurs and state. We will be in the ocean of fakes and under tsunamis of disinformation in the boat where we can be honored, happy of the only naval armed forces of Ukraine.
Thank you a lot, Mr. Yevgen. Now, another perspective on these ongoing problems and the correlation between the damage for civilians and the hybrid threats. Now, let's move on to possible activities from various agencies, facilities, organizations. What can be the role of armed forces of Ukraine, of international organizations? I call on all of you to comment on this, including our online participants. Now I'm giving the floor to Mr. Alexei, and tell us what he thinks about this. As a person with outstanding experience, he has seen a lot what's happening to civilians under hybrid threats. Thanks for your kind words. First of all, I'd like to defy the idea that the hybrid war is something new. It didn't appear during the last decade. I support the idea that little has changed since the Roman Empire. We can remember Roman empires called everyone else barbarian tribes, and at the same time used those barbarians for certain services, for serving Roman interests, for protecting Roman interests throughout the empire. So hybrid war is a new word, but it's not a new method. Even during World War II, it was started with hybrid methods, hybrid techniques. It started with disinformation that became the fundament for military intervention. The theory of military and civil cooperation was based on scientific research, but I think that a hybrid war is the war for the hearts and minds. Crimea was occupied with hybrid methods. All of us today have been talking about information instruments. And yes, the information sphere and information instruments belong to the state power and authority everywhere, belong to their scope. But I would like to talk more about the armed forces of Ukraine and my experience. I'd like to share my point of view, and based on my experience and my service in armed forces of Ukraine in Iraq and in the east of Ukraine. Why information instrument is so powerful and so effective. In 2014, we've seen that Ukraine cannot be occupied from outside or destroyed from outside because the conflict consolidates the society and the power and the authorities. But unfortunately, we cannot capitalize these victories in the conditions of a frozen conflict. So the threat is they can't take over us from outside, but the Russian Federation keeps weakening our society because during the 30 years of independence we failed to create the true Ukrainian citizen. Our cognitive resilience is suffering. The citizens of Ukraine are very susceptible to information fakes and information influence. Low cognitive resilience damages the fundamentals of our preparedness. What do the armed forces do for this? So they protect the territorial integrity and the defense of the country. This is put down in the constitution of Ukraine. Another function is educating the society and consolidating it. This is the task for government authorities and the community. Well, government authorities are replaced every 5 years, but the civil organizations are more sustainable, so they must understand their responsibility for this civil consolidation and educating, upbringing the young citizen. With civil-military cooperation experience, I'd like to say that one of the instruments in war regions is the concept of protecting civil citizens. The armed forces there must keep playing their important role. In other regions of Ukraine, the armed forces should participate in the national patriotic education of the citizens. Of course, it's the responsibility of the cabinet of ministers, and the military men are responsible for military training and education, not only in military units, not only in the pre-planned military events, but also we should proactively contribute to consolidating the cognitive resilience of simple citizens, just regular boys and girls. In fact, the influence from the Russian Federation, political, economic, social, and military, they serve three purposes: discrediting the military forces, discrediting the elements of safety and security of Ukraine, its role and purpose in society, its discrediting or even manipulating the information about corruption in Ukraine. Corruption exists in all countries of the world, except maybe the moon, but it's because nobody lives there. Corruption is everywhere where people live. Ukraine made huge steps compared to even to Western countries countering corruption, but Russian propaganda is still saying that Ukraine is a corrupt state. Next, the quality of the political sphere. They're trying to discredit not only our authorities, but they're using pro-Russian political parties and organizations that are broadcasting certain Russian Federation narratives. I think we can build a successful Ukraine of the Western direction only if we care about and educate the next generation, the younger generation. We must educate a resilient citizen of Ukraine who understands what Ukraine is, what defense means for Ukrainian integrity and sovereignty and the values of Ukrainians. We must educate the youth about the role and place of Ukraine worldwide. In many situations we are victorious, but if we analyze the content of Ukrainian mass media, unfortunately, and it's a fact, Ukrainian content becomes more popular if it talks about negative sides of Ukraine. So we should work on our content. We've been studying content of the Russian Federation and of separate regions of Donetsk and Lugansk regions occupied by Russian Federation, and they only had 10% of negative content, 90% of positive. It gave hope to the people on the occupied territory. They said, you have to wait a little bit and everything will be fine. We must give hope to our citizens. We need to show how many victories Ukraine has and make us proud. Must use the mass media as an instrument and to transmit messages. Thank you, Alexei. The idea of positive messaging is still on. We need it's So we need to build those positive messages on something. We need to consolidate solid data. I think it's the task for all branches of state power. Another small comment, and now I'll give the floor to the Q&A to all of our speakers. Ewan, I think, to Ben, Lubov, both Eugenes, and so on. So the hybrid war has existed for centuries. Of course, there are military methods and information methods, but now this pyramid is turned upside down. Kinetic methods and measures defined 90% of military success, but today some experts think that only 20% of kinetic measures, just simply solely military measures, define only 10 or 20%, up to 20% of the success. And in the modern world, the wars never stop at all. Before the postmodern epoch, you could run the war, sign the agreement, and then get prepared for the next war. Nowadays, it's impossible. The civilians will always be in threat that the hostilities can be reactivated at any moment. The frozen conflict was re-escalated in like a couple of days. Now, the floor to questions and answers. I'm Colonel Shedluk, Fellow of the Strategy of the Department of Safety and Security of the National University of Defense of Ukraine. For 5 years, I've been working on strategic communications and practice, specifically what Lubov Cebulska mentioned. And we tried to tell the truth to the people. Now I work in education, I teach, and I research strategic communications. I'd like to share my thoughts briefly. At the beginning, we have to define the problem. The problem is not only in Ukraine. As we see in Belarus and Western countries, the source of the problem is the aggressor, the Russian Federation, that uses its financial resource to threaten almost every country in the world, especially the neighboring countries, especially those that they chose as victims. So, if you think that Ukraine will just host this problem, that's it, it's a mistake. Because as I see in the tendency, all countries of the world will soon, in some way or another, have to face the problem of Russian aggression, Russian hybrid, mixed aggression. It doesn't only influence the mind. It comes before taking over the territory. First, the Russian Federation influences the consciousness of people, and then they move over to the active phase, like with Ukraine. The active phase, I think, started in 2013, when they started to divide the society. We must understand the spheres of the hybrid aggression. First of all, it's the political sphere. The Russian Federation is spending a lot of money to take over the government power and appoint their representatives. They are attacking democratic institutes of the country. The president of Ukraine, Yanukovych, the former president, fled Ukraine, leaving the country without management, which was a problem of our recent experience. Other spheres: cultural, historic, social, legal. You know how many Ukrainian soldiers are in court-martial abroad because of just futile accusations. The military sphere, the intervention taking over the territory. What should we do in this situation? Not just voice the problem, but to suggest solutions. First of all, let's talk about the mindset. So first, the mindset of the government officials should be that they should be aware about the strategic communications, about education. We should organize experience exchange, and we should aim at the values. So strategic communication is an element of culture. It's a combination of experience plus the Ukrainian values, the general humanitarian values. In tackling this complicated task, we should have resources to implement all that, because it's the authorities, people, finance, channels, movies, radio. And in this sense, I'm convinced Ukraine has serious problems. The most pressing is, well, it's all intertwined, it's all interconnected. People who are experts in their sphere are taught in our center, the officers of all levels, as experts of strategic communications. Also, we teach them democratic civilian control, which is key for the existence of a democratic state. And we cover all spheres, the public diplomacy, civil-military cooperation, and PR, military relations, psychological operations that are run against the opponent, against the enemy. These spheres are very important. And the third part is the development of strategic communications theory. The experience, exchanging experience, teaching each other, because here at this room we already have developed common values. We all understand that people are key, people are the most important thing, the national values are the most important. We stand as one in these aspirations, so we must be professionals in this sphere. Another illustration to this, it is, first of all, the Russian Federation influences the poorly educated groups of people. Those people who are influenced by the thoughts of others, rather than their own. It's easier to manipulate such people who do not know the subject deeply, or I sometimes even call it the expert war against us. We must all aspire to become experts and professionals in various fields and take account of our target audience to to broadcast, to address the audience, the in correct narratives and the messages.
And we should share with our foreign partners in the way of diplomacy to show that armed forces are defending Ukrainians, our state, from the aggressor, from the enemy, and they are striving to achieve within the European community to achieve dignity, trust, and to show that Ukrainians are friendly partners for the whole of the world. Thank you, Mr. Victor. So we are both participating in the initiative such as training for the officers on the civil and military communication. So in the same course we have the strategic communication and civil military cooperation. So there is a very good language because between those topics. So as soon as we have the Center of Excellence on civilian protection of civilians, your center could join us in these activities. And now I would like to pass the floor to the expert on the information warfare, the deputy head of deputy minister, to Mr. Dmytro Zolotukhin, who will join us online with his comment. If he is still with us. Do we have the chance to see him? He presented a white book. Can you hear me? Yeah. Good afternoon. Do you hear us? Yes. Just a few seconds. Good morning to everyone. I'm very thankful for the invitation. I cannot hear Mr. Sergey through Zoom. Just show your hand when you want me to stop my presentation. Once again, thank you for the invitation. The speakers are excellent, and we still have only 15 minutes. I will be very brief, and I will tell what I heard, and I would like to share. Usually on such types of conferences, I have the feeling of the Hedgehog Day, that we are speaking on the same topics every day. My feeling is concerning the protection of civilians in the armed conflicts. And I would like to say that I am not an expert in the protection of civilians in the armed forces. For me, it sounds to protect the virginity during sex, and I think that the best way is to stop the conflict. That's why we believe that for the Ukrainians, and also the social polls show this, and to all adequate representatives of the international politicians, the ending of the war, the termination of the war with Russia is the final goal. But we know that the keys from this magic door is only in the hands of one person, Mr. Vladimir Putin. So we can speak as much as we wish what we have to talk about with civilians, how we should build our relations with them. The decision on the future of the situation, the only one person will take. and we know where he sits. As I saw from the logos our German partners, I would like to recollect the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Germany, Heiko Maas, reiterated once again that they have to collaborate with Mr. Putin, and Nord Stream should be still constructed, and the construction should be ended. And Mr. Maas said that the cooperation should continue with Russia. Unfortunately, we are not coming closer to the goal which we have, to make the person who is responsible for the ending of the war, and to my mind, the most effective way of protection of civilians. So we are not forcing him to end the conflict. And I think that on all the platforms we should send greetings to our German, French and other partners who continue telling us how we should collaborate with the civilians in the conflict area while they are earning money with the companies who are linked with the person who started this conflict. The second point is the notion of the hybrid war. With my deepest respect to Mr. Rozdrachov, and sometimes I'm feeling sorry that I declined his offer to become an officer in his department. I fully agree that the fog of war before the hybrid war was invented, so the fog of war was still known from Sun Tzu time and in all the historical time. But our issue is that in June 2014 this term became very popular, and the person who started the hype about the Mark Galeotti on the crime in Russia and the Soviet Russia and the Russian Federation. And then he said that this term was invented just for hype, that there's no doctrine, and there are only articles where he found this term. There are other terms as reflexive control, reflexive manipulation, reflexive control, as NATO partners say, and a number of researchers were conducted. The point is that the hybrid term has no borders. So if we use the term hybrid war, is not very productive, because there is no ending of this hybrid war, and we do not understand. And we hope that this conflict in Ukraine will end. The hybrid war with Russia will never stop, and the civilians should be protected anyway, even when they will be deoccupied. As for the information and psychological influence and media perspective of this work, I can talk 24/7, but from 2014 I'm reiterating one and the same statement, which we found out with my colleagues who worked in the area of psychology. And from the point of view of the human psychology, to my mind, people who are under influence of Russian and pro-Russian media on the occupied territories have the same mindset, which have people who are in the religious sect, And so when you are coming, that Santa and Elijah is just taking money out of you, and you're paying it. So what is about salvation? They're just willing money from you, but a person is saying, you are not willing my salvation. You are a sinner. You are distracting me from my salvation. So whenever type of relations we build or use any media tools, we have to understand that unique possibility to take a person out of the religions is stopping the contacts with the people who are bringing this information to this. So first, he or she should stop taking the poison. So they should stop watching Kremlin TV or any other TV channels. And we should be realistic. It's not possible. That's why, if we speak about military aspects of collaboration with the civilians, we should always speak that it will be somehow manipulative. I was listening to the speakers and I recollected one episode, and I think that the senior officers remember this propaganda film in the area of special attention. So when one of the protagonists meet the grandma with the sheep, and he says that the tanks will say that the tanks will come, and she says that there is no way to come here, and he says no, the tank will go here. So as soon as the military leadership has the tasks, they have to understand that there are strategic communications, and there are press services of different state authorities, and they have to bring the real information to the civilians, and they have to tell what exactly the state wants to tell to those civilians. And the hybrid warfare, and if we use in fact this term, means using of the methods of reflexive control. And we should be aware that unfortunately it's not possible to understand that we should use manipulative methods with those people. Otherwise, we will not achieve the goal which we are striving to achieve. And we're very skeptical to the recommendations of our foreign partners, because 2 days ago I was listening to the sitting of the committee of the U.S., where they now believe, a lot of people in the U.S., that the coronavirus was invented by the Democratic Party. And in this way, a lot of people believe that Donald Trump believes that he was sent by the reptiloids or by the God to protect people from the virus which was invented by the Democratic Party. And in Great Britain, a number of people were setting on fire the mobile towers, the 5G, because they believed that 5G is spreading coronavirus. So we should look how those practices are functioning abroad. I mean, collaboration and communication with the civilians. Thanks a lot for your attention. Thank you, Dmytro, for your idea, for your opinion. It adds to the diversity of opinions which we have. And now I would like to pass the floor to Beatrice Godefroy, who will give her comment.
I'd like to start ask questions if that's the right moment for that. Okay. So thank you very much to all the speakers for these very, very insightful contributions. So as Ewan has mentioned, the topic we try to explore and delve into at Civic is indeed this relationship between hybrid threats and the protection of civilians. And I think there's been a lot of contributions this morning looking at how civilians are at the same time target and a tool in these matters, and notably looking at how working on the protection of civilians in terms of making commitments and implementing commitments is a way to counter hybrid threats. I think it came out very strongly from the various contributions. So I would like to maybe ask this question to the panelists and to the experts in the room and on Zoom, looking at this relationship the other way around as well. So not protection of civilians as a tool to counter hybrid, but understanding better how hybrid threats impact negatively the protection of civilian and civilian harm. I think some of the speakers have mentioned psychological harm. I've mentioned as well potential tensions in conflict areas. But I would like to maybe direct these questions to Colonel Nazarchov, Colonel Shivluk, if you'd like to, since you have this in-depth field experience of what the military and the communities face on the ground. Maybe also Ben or Ewan online can also comment on that one. Thank you.
Шановні експерти, якщо хтось
The experts, if someone wants to answer, I think it's a question to me and to my colleague. I will repeat the question: how the hybrid threats and hybrid warfare influences the protection of civilians in the armed conflicts. So what is the system of the protection of civilians? It's in the information area or in the informational warfare. It's a message from the state that the state, through all its capabilities, is taking care of its population. That's the main information message, that the civilian who was harmed by the conflict will not will be remembered, and he or she will receive all the possible assistance, social, physical, material, and so on. And of course, the hybrid tools, as Mr. Dmytro, unfortunately, who didn't become an officer in my department, that the hybrid tools will ruin the trust to the state and all the tools which the state is using.
So it will be both discrediting the armed forces and other militarized law enforcement agencies, discreditation of local authorities, and manipulation of information about the accessibility of this protection, of this help to the civilians. So in the information sphere, these methods of hybrid war will affect the entire system of protection of civilians. So these instruments of a physical influence, ruining by artillery or air force or undercover groups and brigades, mass killings of civilians, and manipulation of the results of these actions is also serious hybrid influence that will affect the protection of civilians system. We are now not discussing the counteraction of the state because we're short on time, but the message not only affects the feelings of people, it can kill. A message can be physical in the form of an artillery bullet. And also the message can influence the cognitive sphere of a person through media. From the practical viewpoint, from what I've seen, the information and psychological influence is so important because when people are hostages of the aggressor, they suffer a certain psychological state caused by deprivation of food, of the basic, based on Maslow pyramid, basic needs that we satisfy thanks to the checkpoints. And I used to organize one of those checkpoints in 2014 in Knutovo. And for the civilians, we did these blindage covered locations for hiding for the civilians. And people who are held hostages start to develop psychotic states because of constant pressure, anxiety, and the feeling of helplessness imposed by the aggressor media. So this cognitive sphere is very important. And being unprotected physically, with no chance to go to the court, to the law enforcement, with no chance to go to the hospital. This also affects people a lot. We try to alleviate these fears and give as much guarantees as we can. Sometimes people are just stuck there because of their age or some other reasons. They cannot leave these territories. It's very important for the armed forces just to be present there, to let people know they are there. They are prepared to support the civilians, to protect the civilians. When the civilians feel the protection of the armed forces, like in Mariupol, the civilians feel a lot better. They feel secure. They feel safe. On all territories controlled by Ukraine, they have police protection, court services, healthcare. We guarantee, basically, we guarantee all of this. It would be perfect to liberate these territories, and those citizens will be safe, and then we can guarantee the democratic elections and all possibilities that there are right now on the controlled territories. Any other questions? Audience, speakers, online, offline? Then, if I may, I'd like to comment on this, what Mr. Victor said. On how the damage to civilians happens due to hybrid conflict. The field mission of Civic, when we visited the village of Bogdanivka near Granitne and Mykolaiivka, we saw maybe 8 people. Almost all of them are elderly people. When you see an elderly man of like over 60, we talked to him and asked him what his life is like. His entire life is watching TV and once a month receiving assistance from humanitarian missions. So he receives his pension, his retirement pays, his product basket, and that's it. People shouldn't live like that. The artillery, the missiles are not bombing his house anymore. No kinetic war right now, but is still gravely affected by this war. So when international organizations do their job and give humanitarian aid and help people in the conflict zone, it's still not enough. These people are under extreme negative aspects of the military conflict. We have talked about psychological warfare a lot, but just imagine that for 8 hours a day you're watching TV while you have the power, the electricity, and you spend all the other time trying to make your living. Your relatives cannot help you, or you have no relatives left at all. So that's it. That's the situation. That's the hidden loss, hidden damage that we choose not to mention, not to notice, but it's still there. Unless we find a way to help such people, this damage will continue. So our job at Civic also includes finding the ways to help the military officers, to our international partners, to better satisfy the needs of civilians. There will be no ultimate decision. I think that's a call for a Nobel Peace Prize, but we'd like to hear from you what can be done. You should suggest it, because our just opinion is not enough. Oksana Sukharukova, the Ministry of Temporarily Occupied Territories. I listened to the problems on that territory. We know about it, but there's another aspect. There's a program called Humanitarian Program for Restoration for the people of Donbass. It's aimed at 3 things: healthcare, education, and culture. People from the Ukraine-controlled territory receive healthcare. We are recording facts of people coming for help for cancer treatment, assistance with education, paying tuition, the tuition fees, students' fees, and organizing free exhibitions, concerts, and cultural events for people coming from non-controlled territory. So our task is counteracting. Our program has been on since 2017. What does the ministry do nowadays to counter these things? First entry point is the entry-exit checkpoint. Sometimes they didn't even have a place for the water closet or drinking water or something else. Starting from now, the people coming to the entry-exit checkpoints, they will receive the entire set of services, including the administrative services, the bank branch, postal offices, health aid offices, and the lounge zone for the zone for mother-children care, the zone for just satisfying the basic physical needs. Unfortunately, there's not enough communication about healthcare, including healthcare for people on uncontrolled territory. The entire time before the conflict, before the war, we have the model of receiving medical services based on their residence. with this healthcare reform, it says that the person can address the doctor anywhere, regardless of the residence status. They just need to be a citizen of Ukraine or a person having the equal rights to the citizenship. People who live at the uncontrolled territories can also, with no limitations, must be entitled to medical assistance. So at those checkpoints, we will have primary healthcare, referrals to specialized healthcare, and issuing prescriptions based on accessible healthcare program, accessible medicine. So for cardiovascular diseases, type 2 diabetes and asthma. And starting from the second half of 2021, the reimbursement package will also include insulin. This will show that the state of the government takes care of the people regardless of their place of residence, of their location. It doesn't matter what beliefs they hold. They, as citizens of Ukraine, can still come and receive this help. Another task is to reach out to the youth from the non-controlled territories and to give them access to education in Ukraine and stay there at the territories controlled by Ukraine. Come here and study. We have successful experience of civil organizations who prepare children to pass in the Unified State exam, the final school exam. And they also tried to meet other needs, receiving passports by the youth residents and earning money for the living when they come here. Another global challenge today is covering the entire contact line with healthcare services and restoring the services that are absent in Donetsk and Lugansk regions now. At this very moment, there is a negotiation on restoring the highly specialized specific healthcare in Donetsk and Lugansk regions and building the hospitals. Thanks for these specific examples of what the government is doing to help the civilians during the hybrid conflict. Another example, you might have heard, what is the most popular profession among teachers on the occupied territories? Surprisingly, but it's the profession of teaching Ukrainian language, because Ukrainian language is basically non-existent in Donetsk and Lugansk non-controlled territories. But in order to prepare to the children to enter a Ukrainian university, they are hosting undercover classes of Ukrainian language, very covert, very hidden teaching and learning. So this hybrid war format creates these new challenges. Access to education becomes even threatening for children and the teachers. So this demonstrates how many hidden aspects there are. But at the same time, all of these challenges open opportunities. So if we have this problem of access to education in our coronavirus time, using online platforms, there are lots of opportunities for children to get a Ukrainian government diploma in Ukraine. My child goes to the online long-distance school. Maybe it's even more efficient. Do we have any other questions, maybe from the room? If not, I'll try to.
And maybe that's for our experts online. Maybe Ben would be interested to answer. He mentioned in his remarks the fact, and a few other speakers also mentioned the fact that hybrid threats or hybrid tactics were not new per se. What was new was the technology. And so I would be very interested if you could delve a little bit more into this technological aspect, and also going forward, how he sees the technology evolving in the next few years, and what type of potential evolution of threats we need to be prepared for, having again the protection of civilians in mind.
Man, are you with us? Hello? На жаль, Бена вже зараз з нами немає.
Unfortunately, Ben's not here with us. I think we'll have to readdress the question of Beatrice to him after our meeting until respond. So, with no further questions, I'll try to give a little wrap up. And we discussed quite a wide range of issues, and we found out that there is damage for the civilians caused by hybrid war, and these aspects and manifestations are diverse. We mentioned the information aspect, psychological damage, and how the tactics of the hybrid war influences, affects the audience, and how it changes the behavior of these audiences. We also discussed what is the current situation of the conflict. Are there any tendencies of this, of when people are tired from resilience, from opposing? Are there any changes in using media literacy? Everyone knows that there is influence of disinformation, but how does the society react? These patterns, they are changing now. We discussed that the wide range of partners, including the state authorities, the military structures, NGOs, international organizations, can and must react to these hybrid threats. The solutions should be identified, and new approaches should be used. So we should be prepared to a fluid situation, an ever-changing situation, and we can find certain solutions even in such complicated conditions. It also applies to strategic level of the state policy development. And as we discussed yesterday, the strategy of protection of civilians can be a response to the damage to the civilians due to hybrid warfare, hybrid threats. And up to the operative level, when ministries and educational facilities apply these mitigation techniques down to the lowest level, when they are like opening water closets for people at entry-exit checkpoints. If we miss any of these levels, say at the tactical level, then the efficiency of our activity, regardless of our super strategies, will be zero. So, on this note, I call on all of you to fruitful work in this direction. I call upon cooperation in the future. Our contacts are are there available to you. We are still in Ukraine. We continue work, and I wish all the best to you in your work as well. Thank you very much.